All right, thanks a lot. So since Alan is not here, he is obviously not able to respond. I don't know, Myman, do you want to say anything further in his persona or otherwise?
I don't know that I'm either qualified to say anything much more in his persona or that I have much will to do so. The one thing that struck me on page 11 of Alan's paper is that, in a sense, Solomon may have been kind of charitable to Alan in suggesting that Alan claims only that some historians reject the idea of there being any possibility of historical truth. I read the first full paragraph on page 11 to say virtually all, or perhaps all historians, reject or ought to reject that idea. And for those of us to whom Leopold Ranke's famous idea of history that it's wie es wahrlich, eigentlich gewesen war, that its history is about how it really was, is a historical idea that Alan doesn't seem to take on board at all. Why don't we go to the questions?
All right, well, we've got a lot of questions, so hopefully people will be brief, and we will start off with John McGinnis, Jim Allen, and Nathan Chapman. John?
I'd like to begin where Larry sort of left off, talking about the comparative portion of this paper. And Hutchinson makes a challenge to originalists. Well, how could you, what would you think of the Canadian practice? And I think Larry begins to make, I think, a point, which is, well, the Canadian, at least the original Canadian Constitution, comes from a completely different process. It's imposed. It's the opposite of what Mike and I talk as a consensus process of the nation. And so it's not at all clear that you should be originalists in that respect or adopt the idea that judges can amend the Constitution. And given that that's the kind of interpretive practices, you might actually think, well, it may be that those practices persist even in the Canadian Charter. I'm agnostic about that. I don't know enough about it. If I might just point out that I think there's an interesting connection between this paper and the paper by Jim Allen on the Australian Constitution. The Australian Constitution, in this sense, I'm not sure you're saying you're endorsing it at all, Jim, but in the sense that the Australian Constitution is a constitution that comes from a supermajoritarian consensus process, and I think it's not a surprise that that is the country where I think there is the strongest persistence of originalism because of the connections and the processes.
Jim Allen, you can address that or otherwise.
Well, I had a question really aimed at Alan, not faux Alan, although I thought the faux Alan Wyman might have actually every 2 pages said this in the sort of weasel words of the paper. This isn't really a critique of originalism. You have to throw that in every second page. But the problem with Hutchinson, many of them, but it's like a pre-so-called hoax world you're reading. But look, he's wrong about Canada. He's wrong on a number of levels. He takes one quote out of context from the then Justice Minister, and he leaves out all this other stuff, as if you could amend the Constitution by saying to people up front, there'll be no constraints at all. That was not what happened, I don't think. The real critique about the Canadian Amendment in '82 was that they never asked anybody. There was no election, and even at the provincial level, there was no referendum. Trudeau ran on the price of gas, and then he brought it in with a 5-year mandate. So that's my objection. Larry and John are both wrong in this sense. Like I can trace ancestors back to what we call United Empire Loyalists, who on the losing side of the War of Independence. Nobody thinks that the British North America Act, no Canadian thinks that's imposed on them. And nobody thinks the Privy Council was a foreign court. I mean, we were part of the empire. That was the top court. For good or for ill, that's not where the illegitimacy comes into it. The illegitimacy comes into it in the way that Trudeau amended it in '82, in my view. But here's the thing about Hutchinson that's really, really irksome. The guy made his career early on arguing in favor of democratic decision-making. I'm a democratic decision-maker. I don't like bills of rights. He's coming at it in this faux way. If you didn't know what he had written earlier in his life and you read this paper, you could not tell that the early Hutchison thinks that judges ought to butt out. There's no indication in the early Hutchison that he's a living constitutionalist, which you get throughout this paper. So I'm really sad that he's not here today, and Lyman had to step in, because I would have liked to have seen him respond to comments.
Nathan Chapman.
So I'm not really sure who these are aimed at anymore. But I have a couple thoughts that I'd love to get the collective wisdom offline, maybe if these raise thoughts of anybody else. The first is that, as a matter of intellectual history, is it just as fair as Hutchinson's account to say that originalism was an effort originally to gain some kind of objective approach to constitutional decision-making in the face not of liberalism per se, but a sort of social cultural phenomena of a ripping apart of consensus on fundamental moral and political issues, such that the possibility of consensus again and using that consensus to interpret the Constitution was not going to work. And so we need some objective thing, not to get conservatives to win. Because if you're conservative, the way you fight back is you just argue for radical judicial restraint. And that's what some progressives have done in the face of the Rehnquist court. So Tushnet and Kramer say, well, we're not winning anymore, let's get out. That's not what originalists did. The second question is kind of about the relationship between politics and originalism on the individual level. And is there something about being able to sympathetically put yourself in the position of the historical texts, taking them as valid, and doing it well, so being a good accountant of the history, and being basically a classical liberal? I mean, is there some epistemological relationship between sort of intellect and will and getting this right on the history and making the kinds of judgments that are persuasive about what was going on then, that is either generates or is generative of being committed to the core political assumptions that are there. And now classical liberalism basically looks like conservatism and after Rawls. So that's sort of the result.
All right. Well, we necessarily have to be a little bit flexible in the responses since we're missing one of the main characters. But
one reaction about Canada. Jim suggests that the British North America Act, that the 19th century Canadian Westminster Constitution was fully legitimate, and I think that was probably true in English Canada, and perhaps much less true in French Canada. The irony is that the Trudeau 1982 repatriated constitution is also illegitimate in Quebec. The Quebec elites, the Quebec legislature, which calls itself the National Assembly, not coincidentally, rejected the new constitution, continues to reject it. And in a way, it seems to me to suggest that there's another category in addition to the one that Larry Solom suggested a minute ago, namely that as he suggested, you might reject originalism if you take a kind of Garrisonian view that the Constitution itself is immoral, that the content of it, that the substance of it is immoral. Another reason you might reject originalism is that the Constitution about which you might be originalist is, and obviously therefore its text, is dubiously legitimate, that it's never achieved the popular consensual acceptance that the American Constitution clearly has, at least so far in American history, achieved in every generation. And that seems to me to be true of the Canadian Constitution, that indeed it hasn't done that.
just a quick thing back. I mean, from the Canadian point of view, the British North American Act in 1867 was a direct response of a huge Union army on the border 50 years after, from a Canadian perspective, the Americans had invaded in 1812. And so there was complete legitimacy. We were worried about being invaded by a Union army that had done it 4 or 5 decades ago. There was no illegitimacy about the British North American Act, I don't think.
Well,
Outside of Quebec.
Well,
Outside
I was
of
going to
Quebec.
say there was a lot of sympathy actually in Quebec for the American invasion, because the Americans, to a lot of French Quebecers, were seen as preferable to the British and to English Canadians.
Larry, did you
Just
want-
one quick thing about sort of the epistemological issue that Nathan raises. You know, the priors you bring to history clearly have an influence on the way you read the evidence, and especially if the evidence is ambiguous, which it sometimes is. So I think that this is an interesting, important point, but it depends a little bit on what we're really looking for. So if we're looking for first the conventional semantic meanings of the words, right? I think that that's a less ideological enterprise, right? That's an enterprise where your priors you can understand when you disagree, right? In fact, you disagree because you do understand, right? But there's another part of original meaning, contextual enrichment, right? The implicatures, implicitures, the constitutional backdrop, right? Where things are more fuzzy, more ambiguous, more contestable, and hence where we really need to make an effort, I think, to overcome our priors, to obtain as much objectivity as we can get. And, when it's this kind of an enterprise, I think perfect objectivity is probably not within grasp. We're going to occasionally confront a very difficult question with highly ambiguous evidence and see the answer that seems more plausible to us, right? And that's always a worry. But that's just the nature of the enterprise. That's true in law when we're interpreting a contemporary statute or a contemporary line of cases. It's the same problem as we have with historical materials.
All right, the next group, we have Larry Alexander, Will Bode, and then I put myself down. Larry.
Yeah, well, if Hutchinson were here, I don't want to single him out because this is a particular problem I have with a lot of attacks on originalism. So there are references throughout here to the Constitution. And I would want to know, well, what do you mean by the Constitution? And this is, I think, a problem for all non-originalist views. It's not is it a particular set of marks that appear on a particular piece of parchment, or what is it that makes it the Constitution to which we are now disagreeing about in terms of interpretive theory? I think when you go down that line, you're led very quickly to originalism, because you don't have if you divorce the marks from the semantic intentions with which they were made, you have something that is infinitely contestable. It could have been made by Martians. It could have been made by anyone. Once we forget the actual people at the actual time who were communicating something to the rest of us, and so it seems to me that it may be. I mean, so Maimons, as Hutchinson's second point, contrast to the first point, which is that originalism is just a sort of right-wing, the latest right-wing movement. was that, well, the Constitution is a right-wing document of sort. Well, that may be, I mean, my guess is the Constitution is a motley bit of classical liberalism and a bunch of other concerns that were prevalent at the time it was drafted and at the time the amendments were drafted. And it may not be, it may not be anyone's view of the most desirable Constitution. That gets to Larry's second point on the constraint issue, which again, I mean, if the rule of recognition here is that the Constitution is fundamental law, and we have an idea what it means that when we say the Constitution, then it seems to me the constraint comes there until the rule of recognition is changed and we recognize something else as the fundamental law of the land. What I don't see in Hutchinson, I don't see, and I don't see this in non-originalist writings generally. So if we take that parchment and those marks and we divorce them from the original meaning, exactly whose meaning are we going to inject into them? Because who's the we that's going to give it meaning? I mean, one of the virtues of the Constitution, the original Constitution, is it is something that while it may not be perfect from anybody's standpoint, we can all accept it as at least good enough to coordinate around and have a legal system built on. Once we drop the idea that that's what we're doing, it seems to me we have a complete free-for-all.
Well,
my question is mostly for Larry and mostly about the sort of comparative part of this discussion. And I guess I'm wondering, so is it conceptually possible for countries, for say other countries, to have a legal system that rejects either the fixation thesis or the constraint thesis or both? And if it is conceptually possible, what kind of evidence would we care about in figuring out whether a country had rejected them or not? Would that be evidence about what the original intent or original meaning of their document was, and did it intend to fix or not, with those quotes about the living tree? Or would we want evidence about their current constitutional practices and rules of recognition, and we want to know, do current constitutional actors subscribe to something like constraint and fixation? And how would we figure out whether we're originalists or not?
All right, and I'm taking the third slot here, and my comment falls to some extent on Will's, and I think it relates to Larry Alexander's as well, and it has to do with the value of comparativism. So I think of this as sort of a friendly comment on the paper, although I am not persuaded at all by the ideological criticism of originalism, and indeed I've sort of done a little work to try to show that originalism does not invariably lead to conservative results, and indeed I think the conservative justices and some conservative commentators who are not present can be criticized more for departing from originalism in order to reach conservative results rather than using originalism to do so. But where I do think that that there is some merit to the criticism is in a related argument, which Hutchinson doesn't quite make, but I would have liked him to make, which is this. There's a strain of originalism that depends very much on the idea of originalism generating a rule of law. And it's particularly prominent in Scalia's writing, especially in his most recent book, where he talks about that originalism comes from and reinforces the separation of powers, that the legislature makes the laws, that courts do not make the laws, and originalism is a way of reaching that result. And what I think is interesting about the comparative project, as Hutchinson sets it out, although I don't know anything about Canada, so I'm not going to get involved in the debates on that, but just assuming that what he says is true, that the Canadian Constitution is best understood as, in its original sense, a grant of authority to judges to make law, then the association with originalism and the rule of law in the United States, as pushed by people like Scalia, just doesn't hold up in Canada, if that's right. And then what I think is especially interesting about that is doing comparative originalism really challenges you to think through why do you like originalism, if you do? Why do you like it? Because I think in the U.S. context, there may be a number of good things that come together in originalism, and once you start separating them out in other contexts, the question is, what are you going to throw overboard? Are you going to throw overboard this idea of separation of powers and the rule of law to embrace a Canadian originally designed evolving constitution, or are you going to stick with a demand for clear rules, which would encompass, at least in Hutchinson's account of Canada, jettisoning the original meaning? And I think that's a very fair dilemma that he could pose to someone who takes a Scalia-type view of the basis of originalism.
Let me first of all say that I am very sympathetic to Larry Alexander's comments. On Will's question, yes, I believe it is conceptually possible, in a certain sense, to reject either the constraint principle or the fixation thesis. Let me talk about constraint first, right? So my colleague, my beloved colleague, Mike Seidman, has recently written a book that says that we should no longer regard the Constitution of the United States as binding law. We should view it as an important symbol of national unity, much like the flag, right, and continue, to have a certain attitude of respect towards it, but we shouldn't regard it as law, right? So could there be a regime in which we didn't regard it as law? Sure, there could be. Right? It would be very different, I think, than the regime we have now. And Mike Seidman does not claim that his view is our current practice, but it's conceptually possible. Would there be a lot of coordination problems, right, in this regime, and very strange things might happen. For example, California might show up one day with 10 senators, right, and say, our great national symbol, the United States Constitution, has this equality clause, and the equality clause, right, is not binding law, but it indicates a national commitment to political equality, and the only way we can get that is proportional representation in the Senate, right? And I think there'd be a big to-do if this gambit were tried. But it's conceptually possible. So now, the fixation thesis. You can't reject the fixation thesis itself, right? This is something about the way language works. But imagine we put the following clause in the Constitution. It said something like the following. It's the anti-originalism clause. It says, except for this clause, all the words in this Constitution should be interpreted to have their contemporary meaning, wherever linguistic drift shall take them, right? And then there could be a little appendix says, so that means, for instance, the domestic violence clause is about elder, spousal, and child abuse, right? That's conceptually possible to have such a clause, right? And what that clause does is that its fixed meaning then operates on the meaning of the rest of the document. So that's conceptually possible, but really stupid idea, right? But conceptually possible. Mike Ramsey's question. I think that's it's a great question, beautiful question. So I think that the extent to which we would give judges in a constitutional regime the power to engage in what I call amending constructions, right? Constructions that go beyond filling in zones of constitutional underdetermination, but that instead actually alter the core of meaning. That depends on trust. And I think that Scott Shapiro's book, Legality, is extraordinarily helpful on this, right? If you live in, I don't want to use Canada because there are Canadians here, right? So I don't know. And I know more about Norway than I do about Canada. So if you're in Canada, or if you're in Norway, Norway has an extraordinarily high degree of trust and value consensus, right? So it would be perfectly possible under those circumstances to trust judges to do a lot, right? You can have a regime that would do that. It's conceptually possible. Under the right conditions, it might in fact be desirable to do that. The reason the case of the United States is different, and the reason originalism, right, sort of acquired salience at the moment in our political history that it did, is that it was a time where value pluralism, right, made it implausible to think that we could form a social consensus, right, a wide and deep consensus that would trust judges with a power of amendment. And so I think that it does depend on historical circumstances, how much leeway we give judges. And I think that, you know, there are historical circumstances where the leeway could be quite great.
All right, our next group is Don Drifts, Marty Reddish, and Earl Malls. Don.
I have a question for Larry, and it's sort of in defending maybe the motivations of the paper, although not the spirit in which it was executed. One alternative is to work the theory of interpretation forward to the institutions. That's originalism in a sense. Another alternative is to work the theory of interpretation backward from the institutions that are going to operate it. That's process theory, which I would take to be a principal competitor for a pure form of originalism. And let me just point to some facts that might make that second strategy plausible. One is positive political theory's consistent finding that a very strong predictor of judicial behavior is party affiliation, and that's a proxy for ideology. Another is the motivated cognition research that's being done by Dan Kahan and his colleagues, which even when there's incontrovertible video evidence, where you come out often depends on the place there you come in. And the third is the Arovian impossibility theorem, which says if the decision is going to be made by a multi-member panel, no matter what theory is imposed on that panel, you're not going to get a coherent set of results. What's going to happen is that you're going to have some results at least determined by eccentric trimmers in the middle, 4 to 4 to 1, and the one turns out to be the governing vote. So given that matrix of implementation problems, might it not be better to think about questions of institutional competence, consequentialist logic, and the like when we get to concrete constitutional cases, rather than to work forward from first principles? So that's my question for you. For my learned friend, Myman Schwarzschild, I'd like to know the original French for the beau mot, the absent are always wrong.
Next is Marty Reddish.
First, a quick point in response to Jim. Invasion is such a harsh word. We call that helpful intervention.
I know.
But I'd like to pick up on what Larry Alexander
And we gave you the White House. Let's not forget that.
Yes, as I recall. I want to pick up on Larry Alexander's point that if we don't go by what the original understanding was, we basically have empty markings on a piece of paper. I'd like to think that it wasn't that black or white, that there's something between originalism on the one hand and Paul Brest and Larry Tribe on the other. And the example I come up with, interestingly, is not a constitutional provision, and I acknowledge the democratic theory differences here, but I don't think they change the analogy, and that's Sherman Act Section 1. Sherman Act Section 1 textually imposes some unambiguous limits. First, it's got to be a conspiracy, combination, or contract. It cannot be individual action. The words couldn't be more clear on that. Beyond that, while the words are not as unambiguous, they provide a value directive delegation. We don't go back and ask, what did the drafters or those who voted in favor of the Sherman Act think about market divisions in the communications industry? We don't think about what they thought about whether price fixing could ever be justified under a rule of reason. I'm sure they never thought about that. This was a value-based textual delegation to judicial interpretation, and I think it's worked reasonably well. At least I haven't heard a tremendous outcry about it. And I don't know why constitutional provisions can't be viewed in a similar manner.
Earl.
I think my question or comment is actually related to both of the ones just one before me, but I'll start off with a quick answer to Marty's second question, which is because with respect to individual rights provisions in particular, what, quote, judicial activism does is it freezes and prevents flexibility, but that's a longer discussion. My question is with respect to that most people in this room are some degree of originalists or another, or my observation is it seems that in talking about the way it works in the real world, we have to at least come up with some theory is too strong a word, but some recognition of the problem of what I describe as freebies, which is that at some point, even if judges were actually committed to really committed to the idea of originalism, that their other ideological commitments will so shape their view of the original fill in the blank that that they're just going to depart from that. That any rational person would say that they're just going to depart from that. So I think we have to. I don't know how you account for that in theory, but it seems to me. And also the other thing is that you get, well, what about Brown versus Board of Education? And part of the answer to that is yeah, but what about Dred Scott? But I think you have to have some sort of idea that accounts for that in dealing with the operation of originalism in the real world. And that, I don't know how you do that in theory, but I think that it's something that is sometimes lacking in, often lacking in discussions of originalism as an approach, just as on the other side, the idea that having originalism as judicial constraint is important. It's lacking in writings on the other side. And I don't know where that goes, but that was what occurred to me, and therefore it was obviously very important.
I'd just like to say real quickly in response to Marty Reddish's question on the Sherman Act, it seems to me this is something that originalists really have to face up to. But on the other hand, it's also something that living constitutionalists have to face up to, that, at least as you describe it, that I would say a value-laden interpretation of or application of the Sherman Act is in fact originalist. If you're premising the question on the idea that that's what was understood by the people who wrote the Sherman Act. And so originalists have to confront the idea, just as I suggest with the Canadian Constitution, that you could have originalism that actually leads back to in effect, living constitutionalism, because that's what's direct. But on the other hand, it seems like non-originalists have to face up to the fact that that's probably not what happens very often. And it specifically isn't what happens with a whole bunch of constitutional provisions that are actually, I think, quite clearly intended to be specific.
Just on Don's question, I think absolutely your theories of construction, your theories of how constraint would work, need to be responsive to institutional considerations, right? And so, and at a minimum, if you believe in the constraint principle, then it's incumbent upon you to make the case that the constraint principle can work in practice, right? And if it can't, that's a big problem for originalists. I think it can. Perhaps you think it can't. And I just want to say I agree with Mike Ramsey that there's nothing inconsistent between Marty Reddish's description of the Sherman Act and originalism. It, in fact, was a description of originalism. Now, Marty doesn't want to call it originalist, right? And that's fine, right? Labels are not important. If Marty would prefer to call this new textualism or what legal process people were really trying to do all along, I'm fine with that. But if what you are saying is that the communicative content of the Sherman Act has to be consistent with linguistic practice and the context in which it was enacted, and if you think that that communicative content is constraining, right, in a hard way with respect to conspiracies or contracts in restraint of trade, in a softer way with respect to the question whether they're unreasonable, because that's a vague and value-laden concept in its original meaning, I'm fine with that. That's originalism as I understand it. But labels are not important here. Labels are not important here. Marty has written that it is Orwellian to describe that position as originalism, right? And I don't agree with that, because I think that if you do a careful parsing through the development of originalist theory, what you will see is that what originalists have in common in the structure of their theories is exactly the fixation thesis and some version of the constraint principle. But as Marty points out in the article where he says that it would be Orwellian to call this originalist, there was also concern, a motivation for originalism was to provide for a high degree of both constraint and restraint, as Tom Colby has defined those terms. I agree, that is a motivation in early originalism, and it continues to be a motivation for many originalists, right? So, for example, Michael Paulson and Gary Lawson say that I'm reconstructing their position, but I think in a very fair way, that the construction zone ought to be occupied by a principle of deference, right? And Mike Rappaport and John McGinnis say that if we properly apply original methods, that we're going to get a lot more content out of the text, but I think they might be sympathetic to the idea that if there is what they think is only theoretical residual vagueness, that perhaps some principle of constraint ought to operate, or restraint in the Colby sense, ought to operate there. So I don't really disagree with the normative thrust of Marty's remarks, but by my lights, they're a defense of originalism. And I think I'll just stop there because I've probably gone on too long already.
Yeah, just a real quick response.
Just a real quick one. Nobody has taken out 1890 dictionaries and looked up the word restraint or trade. No one has gone back to the debates and looked at particular points because we know they didn't think about it. I think that's a completely different mode of analysis from what I've heard from most originalists.
Can I say one thing? So you said two different things. One thing has to do with the question whether the semantic content at the time is relevant, and I think it obviously is. But you made another point that's quite different, which is about expected applications. And I think that's a mischaracterization of the content of originalist theory.
I am not anti-semantic, by the way.
All right, well, we have a lot of people on the list, and the list is not getting any shorter. But we do have a little bit of time left. So the next three are Steve Sachs, David Upham, and Steve Smith.
Brief. The first is partly for Larry and partly for the absent author, but the discussion on page 18 about the rule of law and whether our system is reasonably just. And I just want to clarify here. I would think based on sort of the positivist, separability of law and morals, that what we really mean here when we're talking about you should only be an originalist if you think the system is tolerably just, means you should only, to the extent that you're given power by the state, act on originalist principles if you think you're doing acceptably good things by doing so. Not that that has an interpretive role, because it seemed to me that interpretation is logically prior to moral evaluation. We have to know what it says before we know whether it's good or bad. And so it might be that in Iran, the right way to read the Iranian constitution is originalist or not, who knows, but that would be a question that you would answer regardless of its justice. The second question, and this is more sort of for the group generally, is what to do about the argument that's made here and that others have made about just the sheer difficulties involved in historical research. And Justice Breyer has a passage on this in the MacDonald opinion where he talks about the reefs and shoals involved in the historical enterprise. It's extremely difficult to come to any real conclusion, and therefore we ought to take account of other things like contemporary values, the goals to be served by interpreting a provision one way or another, et cetera, et cetera. It seems to me that virtually any conclusion like that is going to be more empirically contestable and less subject to sort of observer consensus than a historical question about the meaning of language, even ones that are very obscure. But I guess my question is, to what extent do theories of originalism depend on originalism being feasible to apply, and to what extent are those sort of the breaks? In the sense that if you had a truth and justice clause of the Constitution that required people to do things that were true and just, that we had radical disagreements about and absolutely no idea. Or if you had a clause in the Constitution saying the number of jurors shall be 6 if Fermat's last theorem is true, but 12 if it is false. And it takes 200 years to figure out, what the actual requirement of that provision is. Couldn't that actually be part of the law? It might be extremely difficult to comply with a portion of the law, but that would be sort of a separate worry.
David.
This is partly actually in response to what Stephen was saying. You mentioned that the moral evaluations don't figure into the issue of what the evidence shows, and I don't think you disagree with this, but as a general question, I was somewhat sympathetic to some parts of the article, even though I'm as probably as old-fashioned and originalist as I know. Original expected applications, like have originalism. Isn't it true to say that maybe originalism, or maybe this is not a challenge, just a question. To what extent does originalism presuppose an answer to one of these questions or answers these questions? And they're the following. First, I know they presuppose it. That truth is knowable, truth is to be told. Truth is to be told both in scholarship and in politics. There's no room for noble lies. Judges shouldn't be lying about the Constitution. They should tell the truth. And Hutchison seems to agree with that, because his main criticism, calling it a sin, is that originalists are organicists but lie about it, as far as I can tell. Maybe that's an overstatement of his criticism, but everyone's an organicist, but some of us are honest, and that's better than being a clever liar. But the more particular questions are following. Does originalism propose to answer or presuppose an answer to the question whether the past is knowable? Secondly, whether it's reasonable to obey the past, and maybe the same question, whether it's honorable to obey the past, either in scholarship or in reasonable to pursue the truth about the past in scholarship, reasonable to obey it while you're in politics. And it's important even for the scholar to think the past is reasonable and honorable, because there's so many things you can study in the world. If the past is junk, no reason to obey it, and given the shortness of life, you might as well spend your time studying interesting things rather than, for instance, what some stupid old racist had to say. That's my question. It's just a comment, maybe in support of what you were saying, but maybe taking it further. You were mentioning it's conceptually true that the Constitution could just become a flag, or we could say we don't follow it as a Constitution. And I just want to point out that there have been instances that can arguably impute it to a living originalism in which that's explicitly done with reference to certain parts of it. And one thing I've been looking at lately is the treatment of the nullification of the 15th Amendment. And in the early 20th century, living constitutionalism came to its defense. I found one article where someone just says these paper worshipers think we ought to follow it, but everyone knows government is an organic and living thing, and the spirit of the community is not in favor of black suffrage. So anyway, those are the 2 points.
Steve Smith.
Well, although I thought there were lots of shortcomings in Alan's article, I did want to ask a question sort of in the spirit of the article, because it does raise something that I think is interesting. So I'll try and do this in a provocative, in his spirit. So, originalists typically put a great deal of weight on some sort of a distinction between interpretation and construction, as you do, I think, or not quite the same distinction maybe, but one I think does similar work between meaning and application. So an objection might say, but in the real world, interpreters don't really separate what they're doing into those two phases, or they don't really make a distinction. They don't really use that kind of a distinction. A generation ago, when people used to read Gadamer, I wasn't one of them really, but I heard people say interpretation and application cannot be separate. That interpretation is always already application, and so forth. And you might even say that it's not even possible for them to do it, and we don't want them to do it. I mean, one common observation I think about justiciability is that we want judges to work in the context of concrete cases where they have facts before them. We don't want them just giving advisory opinions on the meanings of constitutional provisions. So if it's true that real-world practice doesn't really recognize or operate according to these interpretation-construction distinctions, and if it's also true, as I think seems plausible, that it's in the construction or the application phase that political values and ideology and so forth is really quite likely to be influential, then one might say the actual process is obviously going to be ideological. And then and I think Alan does say this, and academic theorists who then say, I'm doing a theory of academic originalism and not necessarily of real-world originalism, are essentially providing an apology for a process that is inherently going to be ideological, and are going to be giving us a flawed interpretation of how constitutional interpretation / construction actually works, because it doesn't really work according to those distinctions. But the more gentle question would just be, is there a problem if it's true that real world interpreters don't really recognize or operate according to these distinctions that seem so crucial in the academic theory of interpretation?
Well, we are at the end of our time, but I think it would be appropriate to have a couple of final comments from the panel.
Well, those were great questions, and rich ones. Does originalism depend on feasibility? Well, yes, an originalist method of construction, a constraint principle requires that we be able to get content. I would just say that, it's not the case, it's certainly not a priori the case that we will always be able to do that successfully with respect to each and every constitutional provision. There are some provisions of the Constitution I think are quite hard, including some very important ones, such as the Privileges or Immunities Clause, right, where lots of work has to be done, and I think it's still being done. But until it's done, right, you can't really follow the meaning if you're still pretty unsure about what it is. Steve Smith's question, I think, is just such a wonderful question, but let me just say, in Alan Farnsworth's writing about contracts, he makes the following observation. It used to be quite common to observe the interpretation construction distinction in contract case law, right? Many, many cases. They say we got to figure out what the contract means, and then we're going to determine what the legal effect is. there was a critique of the interpretation-construction distinction, and it sort of said what Steve said. Well, is it really at all construction? Should we really be worrying about what these words mean, right? And so there was a realist critique that aimed at collapsing the interpretation-construction distinction. And Farnsworth makes the following observation, that that's very convenient if you would like to decide contract cases in a way that is inconsistent with the meaning of the contract. And likewise, if there is a modern judicial practice of conflating interpretation and construction, of mushing together the meaning of the text and the process by which we give it legal effect, isn't that convenient if you would like to decide cases in a way that's inconsistent with the communicative content of the constitutional text?
Mike had encouraged us to sort of think comparatively, and the thought that occurs to me is that an awful lot of societies don't have written constitutions, or if they do, only have very recent ones. And I kind of leave it with the question whether the originalist toolbox, the originalist categories of constitutionalism, and constitutional thought have anything to contribute to societies like England without a written constitution, or to the many countries where written constitutions are recent, easily changed, frequently replaced. And that would probably be a topic for another panel rather than this one.
All right, well, we are on the end of the time. Apologies to people who were on the list that we didn't get to, and you'll have to take up your comments with Alan Hutchinson during the break.